I'm Thanks Too Much. And today we're going to be taking a look at Call of Duty Vanguard, a game that has gotten a lot of criticism for being historically inaccurate, but a game that I still find to be historically authentic despite its inaccuracies. I'm going to be going into why. Let's get started. I have an absentee history with Call of Duty. During my late teens and early 20s, I really enjoyed the series. I remember the original Modern Warfare trilogy were games that everybody enjoyed, but after Modern Warfare 3 released back in 2011, I dropped off the map when it came to Call of Duty games. It wasn't because I was tired of the franchise or because I hated it like it's become so popular to do nowadays. I simply stopped buying Call of Duty games. I had other games to play, I guess, and Call of Duty started to feel a bit too similar after a while. Apparently, I missed out on some good Call of Duty games during my hiatus of the franchise. Some of my friends and colleagues would point out their favorite Call of Duty games that I never played. Black Ops 2 and Advanced Warfare always popped up as games that actually have a decent story and a message behind them that's more than just the usual pew pew bang bang. So after over a decade of not buying Call of Duty games, I decided to return to the series with Call of Duty Vanguard. I picked it up because it was cheap, and I preferred a game set in World War II rather than a modern setting. I really enjoyed the campaign, and I got a sort of coming home again feeling while playing it, as if I never left. There was a great balance of exaggerated World War II events and characters inspired by actual people and battles that, while not entirely historically accurate in the small details, still made the game feel historically authentic when looking at the bigger picture. However, while the reviews for Vanguard were generally on the good side, I was surprised at how many people loved to pick apart every last detail of Vanguard and discredit the game as an insult to actual World War II history. Admittedly, the game is a fictionalized version of World War II, and I can see how that can rub people who love history the wrong way, but I never felt its fictional elements were so over the top as to be insulting to the history it was representing. Movies like Inglourious Basterds and Zizou also tell exaggerated World War II stories that still feel authentic to the history it takes place in without drawing the ire of people who genuinely love to study this part of history. Vanguard is a bit more grounded than those movies, but I can see how the small details can drive a history buff crazy. But when looking at the bigger picture, Vanguard found the perfect balance of telling an entertaining, action-based World War II story, while, for the most part, still paying respect to the people and events that are represented in the game. The game's first level sets up the tone very well. Set in the dying month of the Nazi regime, you are part of an elite team of commandos from different allied countries as you try to figure out what the Nazis are hiding even as the war comes to a close. The first level literally has you jumping from train car to train car as you dispatch Nazis, and even one of your commando members helps himself to an action hero moment when he jumps on an enemy truck, shoots the driver, and jumps back on the train as the truck explodes behind him. Exaggerated? Yes. But this first level is important in setting up the tone and objective of Vanguard. This game is inspired by World War II, not based on it. And through its inspirations, it will tell an action-packed story that mostly respects the true events and people that fought in this conflict. Though your team of commandos is initially made up of 6 members, there are really 4 main characters in Vanguard's story. All of them have real-life counterparts. Arthur Kingsley is the team leader. In Vanguard, he is a black British paratrooper who was recruited into the team because of his bravery and leadership skills during the D-Day invasion, which is an event the player actually plays through during his prologue mission once the team is captured by the Nazis. Arthur Kingsley's real-life inspiration is a man named Sidney Cornell, himself a black British paratrooper with the 7th Parachute Battalion under B Company, who also landed on Normandy during D-Day. Just like Arthur Kingsley, Sidney Cornell performed various acts of bravery that not only earned him medals, but also the respect and admiration of his fellow soldiers and commanding officers. After the D-Day landing, Sidney Cornell and his commanding officer, Major Roger Neal, were tasked with eliminating German snipers that were causing the British forces trouble after a gap in their lines was exploited. Under heavy enemy fire, Sidney Cornell and his commanding officer located and killed one of the enemy snipers. Even though Major Neal was wounded in the process, Sidney Cornell's bravery in the face of danger was in full display during this dangerous hunt to eliminate enemy snipers. But Sidney Cornell's greatest feat of bravery came in July 10th, 1944, where his company undertook a difficult raid in the Le Bois de Bavent area where the German forces dug into a farm. What Sidney Cornell did next is described by Lieutenant Colonel Pine Coffin, who saw the event firsthand. Quote, Private Cornell, the runner, and Private Butler, Major Keene's Batman, rushed through the gate and into the farm. All hell broke loose for a few minutes, but soon it was in their hands with some valuable prisoners. These prisoners included 4 German stretcher-bearers whose leader spoke English and immediately put himself and his men at the disposal of the attackers. They did extremely good work during the raid for wounded of both sides. End quote. Sidney Cornell would be wounded 4 times during his time in Le Bois de Bavent, but for his bravery and actions, he was promoted to sergeant and earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Throughout his service, Sergeant Cornell's bravery and disregard for his own safety was a topic of discussion and admiration among his fellow soldiers and paratroopers. Unfortunately, in April 7, 1945, as the 7th Parachute Battalion took an operation to cross the Rhine River, Sergeant Cornell and 24 other men were killed when the bridge they were crossing was demolished as they attempted to cross. But Sergeant Sidney Cornell's legacy lives on in characters such as Arthur Kingsley. While the battles portrayed in Vanguard aren't battles Sidney Cornell took on in real life, Vanguard still does a good job in exhibiting the real man's bravery and leadership skills that did take place in real life. When the D-Day landings in Vanguard go awry, Arthur Kingsley rallies up his men to take out heavy artillery so the D-Day landings don't suffer heavy casualties, ultimately succeeding and saving countless of Allied soldiers. It's easy to see the real-life Sidney Cornell doing something similar if given the chance, considering how many times he put himself on the line of enemy fire to save his fellow soldiers and complete his missions. With Arthur Kingsley, Call of Duty Vanguard honors Sidney Cornell in a way that feels historically authentic. The next member of the squad is Polina Petrova, an elite Soviet sniper. In researching her, I came across a wealth of information on real-life Soviet women taking up arms as snipers to fight against the Nazis. In fact, over 2,000 women fought as snipers during World War II, with only about 500 of them making out alive by the end of the war. But the main source of real-life inspiration for Polina Petrova is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the world's deadliest female sniper, with a record of 309 confirmed kills. Even if we take sex out of the equation, Lyudmila Pavlichenko still ranks as top 5 of the world's deadliest snipers. What's even better is that out of the 4 squad members in Call of Duty Vanguard, Polina Petrova is the closest to accurately portraying the real-life person she is inspired by. Like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Polina Petrova was a deadly sniper with a deep hatred of Nazis. Some have criticized Polina's hatred as too over the top, but when you actually read into the real life of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, it's actually really accurate. One of the small details that goes a long way in caring for Polina's journey as a Soviet sniper is that you get a brief moment to walk in her shoes during her normal everyday life, or at least as normal as it can get when Nazis are at your doorstep. Polina enjoys family time with her father and brother and interacts with her neighbors in friendly but worried conversations as they discuss how the Red Army is handling the Nazi invasion. The war still seems far away, until the bombs start falling. Then all peace, all tranquility, and all the people you interacted with, gone, in a matter of minutes. Paulina's father himself is killed by a Nazi firing squad, and as the war rages on, Paulina will lose even more of those she loves, including her brother Misha. Losing the ones she loves at the hands of the Nazis makes Paulina hate the Nazis with such an abiding passion that she no longer sees them as human. This hatred is very accurate to the real-life Ludmila Pavlichenko for almost the same reasons. In real life, Ludmila Pavlichenko was studying to become a teacher in Kiev when the Nazis suddenly attacked during Operation Barbarossa. Bombing and invading the city from all directions, Ludmila witnessed firsthand the horrors that the Nazis brought to her city, saying, quote, "You do not know what it is to have bombs falling all around you. You do not know what it is to see babies murdered, women and girls ravished by the Hitlerite beasts. You do not know what it is to find the charred bodies of your comrades burned and tortured beyond recognition, to see rows of brave, fine people you knew." End quote. As the war dragged on, Ludmila Pavlichenko would see even more Nazi atrocities committed on her people. In one harrowing example in a town close to Odessa, as the Soviets were defending the city, Ludmila and the rest of the Soviet army were tending to civilians and the wounded. They entered an old folks' home under the impression that they would evacuate the elderly to safety. Instead, what Ludmila Pavlichenko saw were the bodies of over 100 defenseless elderly men and women that were killed and tortured in cold blood by the Nazis. The cruelty and depravity of the Nazi war machine was so inhuman that some of the elderly women were even raped. This was the type of enemy Ludmila Pavlichenko was fighting. So it's really no surprise that she also had such an hatred for the Nazis. She fought at the Siege of Odessa and the Battle of Sevastopol, and even went head-to-head with other Nazi snipers 36 times, killing each one. Ludmila Pavlichenko would eventually have a final kill count of 109, which would earn her the nickname Lady Death. Call of Duty Vanguard has a clever nod to this when Paulina earns the nickname Lady Nightingale for the same reasons. During Paulina's second mission, posters are set up by the Nazis offering rewards to whoever turns her in or kills her. The real-life Nazis tried something similar with Ludmila Pavlichenko. At first, the Nazis tried to sweet-talk her into surrendering by offering her chocolate and telling her that they would make her an officer if she just surrendered. When this didn't work, the Nazis resorted to threats, telling Ludmila Pavlichenko that when they captured her, they would cut her up into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds. This was a point of pride for Ludmila Pavlichenko because she knew that not only did the Nazis know who she was, they were terrified of her. However, even though Ludmila Pavlichenko was never captured or killed, she was wounded 4 times with shrapnel being lodged in her body. The shrapnel will greatly affect her health and force her to return to Kiev for treatment. Though she wanted to continue fighting, the Soviet government thought of her as too valuable an asset to use to fight against the Nazis. So she would fight them another way. In 1942, she was sent to the United States on a tour to inspire the American people to support a second European front against the Nazis. But this is a point I will get to a little later. Next up, we have Wade Jackson, a hotshot pilot who is what Han Solo would have been if he was a World War II dive bomber instead of piloting spaceships in a galaxy far, far away. Out of the whole squad, he's the most straightforward when it comes to his real-life inspirations, with the major difference coming from the character's attitude rather than real-life accomplishments. When you first play as Wade Jackson, you actually pilot his dive bomber during the Battle of Midway, and he is supposed to be inspired by the real-life Captain Vernon L. Michael, who took part in 2 bombing runs during the battle. But I actually think he is more accurately inspired by Lieutenant Richard Best, who, like Wade Jackson, was also a dive bomber who landed bombs on 2 Japanese carriers on the same day, though with the small difference being that Lieutenant Richard Best needed to return to his own American carrier, refuel and rearm so he could do a second run to hit the second Japanese carrier, but I can let that slide for the sake of pacing. While researching for inspirations of Wade Jackson, I was surprised that another dive bomber pilot, Lieutenant Jack Cleese, also landed 2 bombs on 2 Japanese carriers, making Wade Jackson's similar accomplishments even more historically authentic. I've seen criticism pointed at Vanguard because Wade Jackson's co-pilot, Mateo Hernandez, is of Latino descent and throws in a few Spanish words here and there to drive home that point. This has led to many accusing Vanguard of quote-unquote forced diversity, but one quick Google search that led me to credible sources such as the National World War II Museum in New Orleans revealed that not only did Latino pilots fight in the Battle of Midway, they fought throughout the entirety of World War II. In just a 5-minute Google search, I was able to find the following real-life World War II Latino American pilots: Lieutenant Colonel Hector Santa Anna, Lieutenant Oscar Francis Perdomo, Lieutenant Colonel Donald L. Lopez, Lieutenant Colonel Donald S. Lopez Sr., Captain Michael Bresas, Captain Alberto A. Nido, Captain Robert L. Cárdenas, Second Lieutenant Cesar Luis Gonzalez, Lieutenant Richard Gomez Candelaria, Lieutenant Jose Antonio Muñiz, and Brigadier General Elmwood R. Quesada. That last one eventually became a commanding general of the 9th Fighter Command during the European theater of World War II. My point here is that having Mateo Hernandez in these levels of the game is not only historically authentic, but also makes us recognize the bravery that Latino pilots showed as they fought and sacrificed their lives during various air battles of World War II, including the Battle of Midway. The only notable inaccuracy worth mentioning is Wade Jackson's attitude as a hotshot pilot. In Vanguard, Wade Jackson is portrayed as just too eager to win the war by himself. Even his co-pilot needs to remind him that winning a war isn't about individual glory, but about working together and trust in each other, not to be too egotistical as to get someone else killed just because you want to show how cocksure you are. Working together is something real-life pilots that fought in the Battle of Midway knew all too well. In fact, pilots like Lieutenant Richard Best and Lieutenant Jack Cleese always played down their accomplishments by reminding everyone that they were just doing their job in a world and time that needed their bravery, and they selflessly stepped in to do their part. Finally, we have Lucas Riggs. Out of the 4 squad members, he was the most controversial when Vanguard came out, and it's here where I do agree that the inspiration of history portrayed in Vanguard was taken a bit too far, even within the limits of inspiration. Lucas Riggs is an Australian soldier who is part of the Rats of Tobruk, a real-life Australian-led Allied garrison that fought in North Africa against the German Afrika Korps. However, while the fictional Lucas Riggs is Australian, his real-life inspiration, Captain Charles Upham, was a highly decorated New Zealand soldier who fought in North Africa during the First Battle of El Alamein, but he was never part of the Rats of Tobruk. And let's just say that New Zealand fans of Call of Duty were not too pleased that one of their highly decorated war heroes was swapped by an Aussie. Up until now, even though all the main characters were only inspired by real people, that inspiration still knew when to pull back to make most of the squad feel historically authentic. It did this by following simple rules. Keep the nationalities of your inspirations the same, and make sure the events or accomplishments your character take part in have some basis in reality. With Lucas Riggs, while the Rats of Tobruk were real, the only similarity that he shares with his real-life counterpart is that he fought in North Africa during World War II. With Lucas Riggs' individual levels, it's clear that Vanguard wants to talk about the complicated relationships that Allied colonial powers had with their colonial territories. In this case, between the United Kingdom and its colonial territories of the time. English colonies did fight for the Allies, but being looked down upon by your colonial ruler, even if you were on the same side, caused a lot of tension. However, when it comes to Australia during World War II, I was unable to find any tension between Australia and the UK that grew as bad as Lucas Riggs and his Australian buddies portray in Vanguard. The developers of Vanguard wanted to show the painful realities colonial territories faced during World War II, risking their lives for a colonial power that could care less about them. However, I think using the Australia versus the UK narrative was a misguided decision, since there's a lot more evidence that British soldiers had a high level of respect for their Australian brothers in arms during World War II. Not only that, but Australia had a lot more reason to join the war without being forced by the United Kingdom. Japan was a very real threat that was even able to bomb the Australian mainland from February 1942 until November 1943, giving Australia ample reason to join the war. Instead, it would have made a lot more sense to show how Indian soldiers joined World War II to more effectively tackle the treatment of colonial soldiers by the British. India in general wasn't viewed in high regard by the British government during World War II and had a long and cruel colonial history of exploitation decades before the war started. Much of this was simply prejudice and racism. The British did not think Indians were intelligent enough, nor had the aptitude or sense of honor to become modern soldiers. However, that still didn't stop over 2.5 million Indian soldiers from taking part in the war and serving with as much bravery and honor as their colonial rulers. Getting into the details of the UK colonization of India would take me this whole video, but the main point here is that not all of India was united in fighting Nazi Germany due to the hypocritical stance of the United Kingdom fighting against tyranny, when many Indian people saw it as no different than British rule over their homeland. Even Mohandas Gandhi himself, while denouncing and condemning Nazi Germany, refused to fight for the British until India's independence was granted. This led to him and 60,000 like-minded leaders being arrested from 1942 until the end of the war. Some Indians were so sick of British rule that they broke off completely from the Allies and sided with the Axis. These Indians formed the Indian National Army, or the Free Indian Army, and at its peak had 40,000 troops fighting with the Japanese Empire. While their betrayal is not justifiable, it is understandable. The Indian National Army called out the hypocrisy of the UK in greater detail by pointing out how could the British be fighting for liberty when they deny the same liberties to the Indian people. Now, the reason I'm spending time on the British colonization of India is because Vanguard itself wants to talk about this topic. It's the main reason Lucas Riggs is in the game. But the game isn't ready to go all in on the theme of colonization. Instead, they made a fictionalized tension between an Australian character and his British higher-ups that goes beyond the limits of inspiration to explore a theme that had much better historical alternatives. Indian soldiers also fought in North Africa. That setting was already there, and all Vanguard had to do was show how Indian soldiers fought in the North African theater of the war to make an effective commentary about the tensions that occurred when colonial powers need the help of the colonies they mistreat. But by not going all in on the theme of the Allies also being colonial powers and not shedding enough light on its complicated history, the Lucas Riggs character is the only main character in the game that doesn't feel historically authentic because they gave an Australian the pain that actually belonged to an Indian. Switching back to people and events that Vanguard gets historically correct, there are a number of instances where Vanguard uses real-life history to make its story historically authentic. The first might seem inconsequential as it's used in what may seem like a throwaway line, but it's a reference to Madison Grant that Richter, a Nazi interrogator, makes during his interrogation of Arthur Kingsley.
Tell you a story. I have spoken with the Führer on exactly one occasion. He recommended a book to me, The Passing of the Great Race, by an American, a man named Madison Grant. The Führer had nothing but praise for him.
Fuck Madison Grant and everyone like him.
The book reveals that under extreme duress or unfavorable conditions, your people do not deteriorate so easily.
Arthur Kingsley, and really any decent human being for that matter, has good reason to despise Madison Grant, as he was an advocate for the superiority of the quote-unquote Nordic race. He used the debunked practice of eugenics as twisted reasoning as to why other races of color were inferior. The book Richter mentions, The Passing of the Great Race, was a real book that Madison Grant wrote to argue that the Nordic race was not only superior to races of color, but other European nations as well. Hitler did indeed refer to The Passing of the Great Race in real life as his Bible, since it advocated through bogus science why races the Nazis saw as inferior should have restricted immigration policies, forced sterilizations, and even prohibit interracial marriages. As if that wasn't enough, The Passing of the Great Race was even used in the Nuremberg trials as defense for the now defeated Nazi leaders standing trial as proof that eugenics did not originate in Germany, which must have been awkward for the US considering that Madison Grant was an American and his books were also used in the US to justify segregation laws in the era of Jim Crow. And before anyone points out, yes, I am well aware Madison Grant was also a huge advocate for natural conservation in an era where many people didn't care about that stuff. And no, it doesn't offset the utter bullshit ideologies he pandered using bogus science. Madison Grant's ideologies caused countless people real harm, and we should all feel lucky that the bastard died in 1937, before he could do any more harm. To repeat the words of Arthur Kingsley, fuck Madison Grant, and everyone like him. On to a more positive side of representation that Vanguard gets right is the inclusion of the 93rd Infantry Division during one of Wade Jackson's levels when his hot-headedness eventually gets him shut down over Bougainville Island. The 93rd Infantry Division was a real-life all-black division that did fight in the Pacific Theater of World War II, as accurately portrayed in Vanguard. Their real-life history actually goes back even further, as they were also active during World War I, with many of the black American soldiers being turned over to fight for the French during the Great War due to the intense racism they faced with their white counterparts who refused to fight alongside them. Sadly, that racism was still well and present by the time World War II broke out. And one thing that I admire Vanguard for is having the balls to tackle how the US military itself would often ignore their black soldiers. When the group of 93rd soldiers rescues Wade, he remarks how he's never heard of the 93rd Infantry Division. They respond by saying, quote, "I bet you never heard of a Negro before either. We're not exactly a credit-getting business," end quote. I was floored when the 93rd said this. I mean, here's a Call of Duty game of all damn things, letting me know how the history books have ignored these men, their accomplishments, and their sacrifices. I know many people want to think the game just wants brownie points for inclusion, and I've even seen these sections of the game be referred to as quote-unquote woke. But the history of the 93rd Infantry Division during World War II does check out the way Vanguard portrays it, at least big picture-wise. The 93rd Infantry Division did fight in the Pacific Theater of World War II, with Bougainville Island being one of their locations. In the game, the 93rd even have a dig at how the US military would under-resource their infantry divisions of color, as one of them remarks how the top brass barely gave them enough ammo for the rescue of Wade. This also checks out historically, as the 93rd was used a lot more for labor than actual fighting, with their soldiers eager to prove their bravery in the battlefield. Even when they were given the opportunity to fight, the 93rd and other divisions of color would often be under-resourced and had to make do with what they were given. It's these small details that makes the inclusion of the 93rd Infantry Division in Vanguard seem more than just window dressing. It shows a respect, not just for history, but for the men of the 93rd by acknowledging both the struggles of dealing with the enemy and their own brass who saw them as lesser soldiers because of the color of their skin. I understand that other small details can detract from how meaningful this can be. For example, I don't know what the hell an STG-44 is doing in the Pacific Theater in 1942, but I chucked that up to Call of Duty keeping the game elements fun while still giving a low-key history lesson around your fun. I remember Vanguard came under many accusations that it couldn't be bothered to show actual history within its level. Well, how about now? Here is yet another example that, when looking at the bigger picture, Vanguard did a lot more for its history than most games do today. And I genuinely applaud Vanguard for giving an honorable image to soldiers that have often gotten overlooked in the American public school history books. Another part of the game that has gone under extreme scrutiny is the ending of Polina Petrova's second mission in Stalingrad. Throughout the level, Polina hunts down a Nazi leader called Steiner, but loses her brother Misha in the process. As the Nazis panic over losing their leader, the game pans out as the Russians take back Stalingrad, and it's said that Polina's bravery inspired the entire Soviet army to victory. Of course, for history enthusiasts, this was completely insulting. A fictional woman did not inspire the Soviet army to victory. Not one person was responsible for the Russian victory in Stalingrad. I agree that, when you put it that way, it seems that Vanguard has once again stepped outside the limits of historical inspiration. However, I respectfully believe that those who view this section of the game this way have missed the point. Polina did inspire her fellow Soviets to victory through the power of propaganda. If she can do it, so can you. Which does have a real-life counterpart that once again leads back to Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was a deadly sniper, but after being wounded 4 times and gaining the respect of the entire Soviet army, she became too valuable an asset to risk losing in the battlefield. So in 1942, rather than take her back to the Eastern Front, Soviet leadership decided to use her as a propaganda ambassador in the US. Stalin was desperate for the other allies to open a second front in 1942. So to try and convince the American public to quickly join the war in Europe, Soviet leadership sent Lyudmila Pavlichenko to Washington, D.C., where she became the first Soviet to be invited to the White House. After which, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko would embark on a train press tour stopping at major cities around the U.S. to win American support for a second front to the European theater. Along the way, they also created one of the most unlikely and endearing friendships in history, as the sophisticated advocate Eleanor Roosevelt and the deadly sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko would become very close friends. At first, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was shy and awkward when speaking to the press and big American crowds, not helped by the fact that Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't really speak English. It also didn't help that the American press were very condescending towards her, as the idea of a Soviet female sniper didn't seem to sink in. Some even criticized that Lyudmila didn't even wear makeup, and as hard as it is to fathom today, back in 1942, it was necessary to explain to the press that when bullets are flying all around you, you don't really have time to worry about your eyelashes. The initial round of idiotic press questions in the first few cities was making Eleanor Roosevelt fume with anger backstage. But she took Lyudmila Pavlichenko under her wing and taught her how to present herself in public with more confidence and dodge stupid questions with witty responses. By the time she got to my hometown of Chicago, she gave one of her most iconic speeches as she finally called the American people to war by saying, quote, "Gentlemen, I am but 26 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" End quote. From this point on, Lyudmila Pavlichenko would command respect at every city she visited, with Eleanor Roosevelt cheering her from behind the curtains. I understand that Vanguard might have overplayed its hand with the grandeur of Polina Petrova's victory when the game proclaims that she inspired the Soviet army to victory, but I would argue Lyudmila Pavlichenko did something similar as she inspired the American people into fighting the Nazis as she did to defend her own country. Though the US and other allied nations would not enter the European theater for another 2 years, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's stories and grit most certainly played a part in convincing real Americans to enter the war. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and when it was time for Lyudmila Pavlichenko to return to the Soviet Union once her press tour was over, she and Eleanor Roosevelt were sad to say goodbye. But there is a happy follow-up to this friendship, as Eleanor Roosevelt and Lyudmila Pavlichenko would meet one more time in 1957, 15 years later. While Eleanor Roosevelt was on a diplomatic visit to the Soviet Union, she refused to leave without seeing her friend. Needless to say, it was a happy reunion, and even though Eleanor Roosevelt was followed by a Soviet minder due to the political tensions between the US and USSR, Eleanor and Ludmila were able to find a private moment where they hugged, cried, laughed, and reminisced about the time they spent together. Though not a woman to show much emotion, Ludmila Pavlichenko was overjoyed to see her friend again. Eleanor Roosevelt would pass away in 1962. Ludmila Pavlichenko would pass away in 1974. Both women heroes and icons in their respective countries. Now, hopefully, wherever they are, they have all the time in the world to catch up on the good times. Finally, there is one more real-life event that is mentioned in Vanguard that has caused a cesspool of idiotic takes with YouTube comments delving into the deepest forms of racism. At the end of the first mission, when your team gets captured by the Nazis, Arthur Kingsley taunts the Nazi leader who looks down on him for being a black man. He reminds him that after World War I, many German women had consensual relationships and even marriages with black colonial soldiers.
Does the Negro give orders in English too? And do you follow them?
Sie wissen, wie es ist, von einem schwarzen Befehler entgegenzunehmen.
Spricht auch Deutsch! Oh. Please, proceed.
Your Rhineland accent. You must be from Neustadt. During the occupation, you saw French soldiers who look like me carry guns in your streets. Marry your women. That's what I hear when you speak German.
Charming.
Now, one thing to point out here is that Arthur Kingsley is completely right when he says that black French colonial soldiers marry German women in genuine and consensual relationships. The vast majority of relationships that occurred between German women and black colonial soldiers who occupied the Rhineland between 1918 and 1921 were consensual, much to the ire of right-leaning German political groups who hated seeing black soldiers in their country and hated even more seeing the same soldiers mingling with German women. Because of this, many German political groups started spreading false rumors of the uncontrollable sexual depravity of black soldiers, painting them as raping thousands upon thousands of German women. A man by the name of E.D. Morel, who was an English writer and politician, came up with the term the Black Whore on the Rhine, as he greatly disagreed with black soldiers stationed in Germany and with Germany's treatment when the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Ironically, for the standards of the time, this made E.D. Morel closer to being a leftist since he had a nuanced view on the treatment of Germany after World War I. However, he wasn't above adding fuel to the fire about the supposed Black Whore on the Rhine by writing pamphlets falsely depicting black colonial soldiers as savages with uncontrollable sexual desires. Not surprisingly, when the number of sexual assaults was actually investigated by independent sources, they discovered that the stories depicting black soldiers as sexual predators were extremely exaggerated at best and completely false at worst. When an independent English journalist, J. Ellis Baker, went to the Rhineland region of Germany to investigate the allegations, he found that out of the supposed thousands upon thousands of sexual assaults committed by black soldiers, he only found 9 serious allegations of sexual assault throughout a 3-year period for which the soldiers were punished for. In fact, when compared to their white counterparts, he found black soldiers to be much more disciplined and much more cordial with the locals of the Rhine. He was able to verify that nearly all the relationships between black soldiers and white German women were completely consensual. The only other issue was the market of prostitution that many German women were forced to engage in due to the destroyed German economy after World War I. However, white and black French soldiers both engaged in the purchase of prostitutes equally, so it's hardly something that can be blamed solely on black soldiers. As if that wasn't enough proof that the Black Whore on the Rhine was all bullshit, even the locals confirmed that the ones who were more interested in mingling were white German women. German journalist Maximilian Harden wrote about the sexual relationships between black soldiers and white German women living in the Rhine by saying, quote, "German women were chiefly responsible for mingling of colored and white blood which has taken place in the Rhine." End quote. So today, over 100 years after this bullshit propaganda was released, if you still believe the Black Whore on the Rhine was a real thing, then you have been a victim of racist propaganda, and I highly encourage you to pick up an actual history book, or at the very least, do some Google research to know where the real history is. And with that, I'll finish my historical defense of Call of Duty Vanguard. Yes, the game is extremely exaggerated in many areas, but nearly all its exaggerations do have a real-life counterpart that you can point to and realize that it's not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. To be honest, for a Call of Duty game, I'm surprised Vanguard is as historically authentic as it is. It actually takes a stance on calling out racism and racist ideology by condemning those in the past who have promoted such harmful ideologies. I made this video because I was genuinely perplexed why so many people and YouTube channels made this game seem like an insult to World War II veterans, when I found the opposite to be true. I know Call of Duty games are cherished for their multiplayer and their ever chaotic zombies mode, but if you happen to have Vanguard, give the story mode another shot. You'll find a game that, for the most part, treats its storyline exaggerations with the respect that the real-life people and events deserve to be treated with. Thank you very much for watching.